the funders who have made this exhibition and its programming possible, including the Wellesley College Friends of Art and the Clara Friedman Lober 44 Davis Museum Endowment Fund. And I'd like to introduce to you Kristina Jones, Director of the Wellesley College Botanic Gardens, who will be joining the discussion tonight, and Ruth Rogers, Curator of the Clapp Library Special Collections, who will also be joining the conversation tonight. And I would like to thank both of them for their collaboration on the exhibition and its programming, and encourage you also to please go to the Botanic Gardens if you haven't been there recently. They have a wonderful exhibition that was organized by Gail Kahn in conjunction with this exhibition, and it's called Art and Science. And they also have done a wonderful job of marking all of the plants that you'll see in the works here tonight, so you can go there and see them live. So it's really wonderful. So this exhibition takes as its premise the idea that botanical imagery can be thought of as a way to know a place. And so it considers plant life as sort of part of the identity of a particular location, and looks at how exploration, world travel on the part of not only explorers but botanists and artists contributed to the kind of world that we live in now, that is one in which we're very much interconnected. So the exhibition is organized chronologically, and the earliest works in the show are late 16th century, and the most recent are from just a few years ago, which are the ones behind you, which we'll talk about later. So we had these early explorers going from, well, the earliest ones we're going to look at were actually going from Western Europe over to the Middle East and to Egypt. And then as we kind of move through the show, you'll see much greater distances and further exploration. But one of the things to me that was fascinating in organizing this exhibition was that I think it's very easy to appreciate how gorgeous these images are. But what we don't always realize is how much is behind those images and what went into the finding of these plants, the collecting of these plants, the recording of them, and the sharing of what was really knowledge that was on the cutting edge of scientific inquiry at the time. So these botanists and artists were dealing with the same kind of hardships that you'd imagine other explorers were dealing with. So things like leeches and ticks and hostility on the part of people who were in locations where there were imperialist powers coming in. So there was all kinds of political and social turmoil that was connected with this. So there's really much more to botanical imagery than might immediately meet the eye, and I hope that's something that you'll see in the context of this show. So I'd like to invite you to all come down this way, and we're going to start by talking about some of the earliest books in the show. So these first two books are based on the work of Prosper Alpini, who was the Venetian Council personal physician, the Venetian Council in Cairo. So Prosper Alpini had the opportunity to travel in Egypt and also the Greek islands. And he took that opportunity to contribute significantly to botanical knowledge. So his book on the plants of Egypt was the very first book that was devoted to that subject. And so this is the book on the plants of Egypt, and then this book is on plants of Egypt and Crete, the island of Crete in Greece. So this particular book, this was actually edited by Johann Wessling, who was a German-born botanist, and he actually succeeded Prosper Alpini as a director of the Botanical Gardens in Padua. And this is significant because the Botanical Gardens in Padua were founded in 1545, and they were actually the very earliest botanical gardens in the world. So this is actually, I'd really like to invite you to come closer up because the images are so small. One of the other things that I like to encourage people to think about when they go through the show is the type of techniques that are used. So there are a range of printmaking techniques used in the works that are in this show, and this one in particular is woodcut. And if you take a look at it, you can see that this is a very kind of simplified image. It's a very flat, kind of two-dimensional presentation of the plant. And the woodcut technique wouldn't have lent itself quite as readily as some of the other later techniques, such as engraving or lithography, to get a kind of image that was more detailed and draftsman. And maybe, Ruth, would you like to talk a little bit about the books themselves?
What fascinates me about book history is audience. In book studies these days, people ask the question, who was it printed for? Who would have been purchasing these books? In the case of botanical books, the earliest ones, well, of course, before printing, there was manuscript, and those were unique. But the earliest printed botanical books were usually folios. They were large. A folio is more difficult to print. It takes more paper. It takes a larger press. As we get into the 16th century and the 17th century, which these books are from, printing was sophisticated enough so that you could get smaller sized books. And the advantage of a smaller botanical book, all of you who collect and go in the field probably know, is that you can take it with you. You can carry it. So frequently when you see small botanical books, they are for portability and for use in the field. And some in the 16th century even advertised themselves on the title page as being after nature, made after nature. And that is significant because in the days of the early Greeks, Theophrastus, Dioscorpius, they were usually without images and was from study, but not with images. So these are smaller portable books. The woodcut, as Elaine said, is very black and white. The lines are thick. They're not as detailed by any means as engraving, which this one is. So when you get a chance, come close and see the difference between the leaves of a plant that are done in woodcut and those that are done in engraving. What it tells you about the engraving, the book with engravings, is that it was a more expensive book to produce. And the reason why, if any of you have done this kind of work, is that engraving is an intaglio process. It has to be done on a copper plate. It then has to be used, it has to be printed on a different press entirely from printing. So you've got a relief press for printing and you've got a intaglio press for the images, for the engravings. So right away the labor is doubled because you have two different presses and two different techniques being used. Still, there was a market for it, and the fact that people were purchasing a book with engravings means that there was a reasonable use for a book like this, probably for medicine, right? And the fact that, you could probably speak more about this, Kristina, but Padua was a very big medical center, and that's where the first anatomist, Vesalius, taught Galileo years later also. So the fact that the first botanical garden was there was probably for medicinal purposes. Yeah, that's not what you asked me to talk about.
And then we also have the title page of this book.
Oh, right. Title page we had to produce in facsimile for you because the difficulty with an exhibition is you can only have one opening. But this enlarged title page shows you on the front, you've got Theophrastus on one side and Dioscorpius on the other side, and they're supporting these double columns of knowledge. So the significance there is that the author is telling you that he is still giving credit to the ancients from whom all knowledge about plants originally came. And you frequently see this, even in the 17th century until later in the 17th century, you see English botanical books like Gerard with images of the first botanists on the title page, to give it gravitas perhaps, or authority. Thank you.
Botanical contest, please. So one thing for me, Elaine had asked me, do we have these specimens in the greenhouses? And so I was looking them up, and these guys are pre-Linnaeus. I had no idea whether we had exactly that species because the names are all over the map. right? Some of them are Latin, which is helpful because I don't speak Latin, but I know plant names in Latin. But this species doesn't match any of the ones that I know. I also couldn't make heads or tails of the order of things in these books because they're not arranged according to Linnaeus' classifications, right, of families of plants. That was not a concept yet. So they're just kind of a field guide as you encounter things. And then sometimes there's an index and sometimes there isn't. It can be hard to tell. So we have marked some arums in the greenhouses that are at least the same genus as this one, but I don't know whether they're the same species. And with the woodcut, you don't quite get the detail that you need to really be able to identify it. And arums happen to be particularly difficult. Their flowers are minute. Another just really fun little tidbit is that Alpini was really the first botanist to ascribe sexual reproduction to plants. And this is the late 1600s. And just that people had been hand-pollinating things like date palms for thousands of years. So they knew that something had to happen to produce seeds. But they hadn't talked about it in terms of male, female, and offspring and things like that. So he, a nice Italian, was the first to do that. And then the next guy here, Tournefort, French guy, completely rejected that notion. Said, no, you're anthropomorphizing plants. They have nothing to do with this kind of thing. So it's just an interesting comparison right here. And you've got the detail. The French botany book has got the seeds, it's got the reproductive parts, but they didn't really think of them in the same terms of reproduction. Until Linnaeus, 1730s, he really based his whole classification on the sexual parts of flowers, so there was really no going back after that.
And I did want to tell kind of an interesting story about this particular plant, which Alpini called Ladanum creticum, and this is a plant from Crete. It's commonly known as a gum cistus or a rock rose, and it's actually something that had medicinal purposes, so it was important as a trade item from ancient times, and it's actually still used as an element in making perfumes. But the way that they discovered this was goats were munching on these plants, and suddenly they had a much nicer odor than they usually and they were getting the gum from the plants, the resin, in their beards. And so actually it was thought that the very best of this resin came from combing the beards of the goats. So Kristina mentioned that this book is the work of Joseph Tournefort. He traveled in the areas of Asia Minor and the Greek islands and Armenia in 1700 to 1702, and he was sent by Louis XIV, King of France. And his system, which Kristina mentioned, was very popular. His system of classification for plants was very popular in the early 18th century. And in part, that was due to the very skilled drawings that accompanied his explanation of the system. And those were done by an artist named Claude Aubrier. So when Tournefort was assigned by the king to go on this journey of exploration and to collect and to record everything that they saw, he said it's absolutely essential that an artist come along on that trip. Because otherwise we're not going to be able to communicate this information in the way that we need to. And I think that Ruth also referred to the fact that many books would say specifically that these were drawn from life, and that was because earlier books would have been done copying an image after an artist's earlier image. So they weren't always done from life. So this was kind of a really important change that happened and is quite significant in the images here. So this book is really fascinating because it is a combination of all kinds of things. So it looks at not only botanical imagery, but it records animals of the areas. You can see on this page there's depictions of women from the island of Amurgos in their traditional clothing. So it records the clothing of the area. It also has maps and drawings of ancient sites. So it's a really wonderful combination, and it talks about the culture and the religion and all kinds of things that they saw there. I actually thought I would read just a really short quote from the book, which is from this page. This particular book is in French, but it actually was published in the same year in English as well. And the earlier books were published in Latin, and maybe actually you would like to say something about it.
One sentence does it. Latin was the language of scholarship. So when a book was published in original German, let's say the first botanical book by Leonhard Fuchs, from whom we get our fuchsia, when that was first published in the 16th century, he wrote it in German. But it was translated into Latin so that it could be exported to countries in Europe where everyone who is a scientist or anyone who is educated would be able to read. So Latin is the language of scholarship.
So I'll just read you this really short excerpt from Tournefort's writing in this book. The 22nd of September, as we passed close by Gallillero, an ugly rock 12 miles from Amorgos, the master of our vessel would needs climb one of its sharp points to take some young falcons out of the nest. We did not dare follow him. This man not only knew how to run up the shrouds, but would scale the steepest rocks with a surprising agility. We desired him, therefore, to bring us all the plants he could light up, assuring him we would willingly resign him our share of the falcons. He accordingly brought us some plants, which we could have preferred to all the birds of paradise in Arabia. And then he goes on to describe the plant here, which is called Lunaria, and I believe we know it as silver dollar.
Or money plant, moonflower, there's a lot of names.
Did you guys want to add anything more about that? Okay. Also, I should have said this in the beginning, but we are happy to have comments and questions as we go through, so please feel free. I know that all of you are here because you have an interest in this material and probably have thought a lot about it. So we are going to move now to some works from the 19th century. Who spent 16 years living in Java, and this is actually a map that depicts his journey. So he had not only studied the plant life of this area, but he also studied the volcanoes, which you can see depicted on the map. His trail is this red line running through. He studied mineralogy, he studied zoology, so he was really kind of getting a complete picture of this area. And at the time when he started his work in the early 1800s, the island was a Dutch colony. And subsequently, it went into the hands of the British in 1811, and then went back into the hands of the Dutch a few years later. So his time in Java spanned this change over in power. But throughout that time, he was always supported by the colonial governments. And this is a really interesting point when we think about this material, because clearly the knowledge that came out of this kind of exploration was really beneficial and useful to colonial powers. So they were coming in and wanting to rule these places. Of course, knowing more about the places was very helpful in doing that. Horsfield unfortunately did not get a lot of credit for the work that he did here, because he came back, he went back to England and had a very difficult time getting his work published, and so it took about 30 years before he actually got the work published. And Carl Ludwig Bloom, who did these two books, who had visited Java between 1817 and 1823, actually published his books and therefore got credit for the information before Horsfield did. This particular flower I wanted to point out, it's called Rafflesia patlum. And one of the interesting things about thinking of this material is the naming of it. And oftentimes names, as well as colonial gardens and these botanical books themselves, were kind of a way of claiming, and they were a way of knowing, and they were a way of holding on to. So they very much contributed to this imperialist notion. This particular plant is named after Sir Stamford Raffles, who was the governor of the British colony of Java. And this plant is just a fantastic plant. It actually was a yard wide, and the center of it apparently smells like rotted meat, and it smelled that way because they wanted to attract flies, which were the pollinators. It's this sort of fleshy, bizarre thing. It actually doesn't have any kind of stem because it's a plant that lives off of another vine. Can I talk more about that?
Yes, it's the flower that's 3 feet wide. It's not the plant is the flower. There's not a whole lot more to it. It's parasitic on a root of something else, grapes, relatives of grapes actually. There's several species of this, and you just get this knot appearing out of a woody root, and that knot all of a sudden gets bigger and bigger until it explodes into this 3 foot wide flower that smells horrendous. And they were never very common, but it was always an event when one bloomed, right? And people had the hardest time understanding what it was. They didn't know if it was a fungus, was it a plant, it didn't photosynthesize, right? It flies in the face of the struggles to define what a plant is. But sure enough, it's now been placed within a regular plant genus. Yeah.
Sounds like a mushroom.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people thought it was a mushroom for a long time, and it does emerge out of wood, like many mushrooms do. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But if you look at it, you can find sexual parts. It's also, I think, separate male and female flowers, so you can't find both of them in any one flower, which is also disconcerting.
And that was only on Java?
There are several species in that general vicinity, and I'm not sure if any of them are only on Java or which one this particular species
But Horsfield discovered it.
Horsfield did not discover it, but he apparently was the guy that was doing botany in Java. And so it was this fellow Joseph Arnold that actually, with Sir Charles Raffles? Stanford. I can't keep these guys straight. That discovered it, but Dr. Arnold, who was a member of the Royal Society in London, actually died on the expedition. These were really dangerous expeditions. He died of some unknown fever. And in the letter that was written back to the Royal Society announcing the passing of Dr. Arnold, it actually spends much more time describing this crazy flower that he had found, memorializing Dr. Arnold. But he had, before he passed away, had described this flower in quite a bit of detail.
And you can imagine this information getting back to, to the Netherlands, to places like Victorian England, and they were completely fascinated. And there was a real kind of interest in the strange and the exotic and the bizarre. And, that continues to have an influence on the travel of these kind of things and the exchange that happens. And when we look at the prints by Isabella Kirkland behind you, we're going to see kind of the result of that. But I think that's a thread that winds through all of these books. Ruth, do you want to say something about the printing and the size of these books, or if you have something?
I don't. All I can tell you is that it is a lithograph and it's hand colored. Color lithography was a real boom to botanical illustration, as you probably know, but it didn't really become good enough until the late 19th century. So everything that you see that's colored in the 19th century, or middle of the 19th century at least, would have been hand colored. So once again, you have a huge amount of labor. That was usually done by women. You have a huge amount of labor that goes into every single one of these books, and even though it is printing, which means it's a multiple, the truth is every one is colored slightly individually. So you do have a relative, I would call it a variable addition.
Yeah. So do you know how many copies were in each edition of the books that you have here?
No, the only way to really find out that is if a publisher's records are extant, if a publisher has left records that one can find that says what the edition was, or if it's such a collectible, limited from the very beginning that it has a statement at the beginning or at the end of the book saying what the edition is. Collectors love that.
And one of the interesting things about the books in this show is that they often were part of a subscription series. So you would buy a subscription and you would receive sections of the book as they were printed. And then you would, and then you would take them to a bookbinder. And so each of the books actually would be different in terms of the binding as well. This is another image from a book by Carl Ludwig Bloom, again of Java. And I think this landscape is a particularly fascinating image because it shows the Botanical Garden in Bogor, which was a botanical garden, a colonial garden, where they sent people out to collect material from all over the island and then brought it back and propagated it in this garden. And what it shows here is the Dutch court, an imperial building in the background, shown from the garden itself, with two palm trees in the foreground. And Bogor, the city, was actually named for the Indonesian word for sugar palm, which was Bogor. So these have this kind of prominence in the foreground, and perhaps also have that prominence because this would have been a valuable kind of plant in terms of trade. Did you want to say something?
No, it was what struck me. The palm trees are right in front, and then these grand buildings are in the back. It's an interesting switch to the usual building and landscape kind of arrangement. Definitely botanical emphasis.
So this was a Dutch building in Java?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we'll move on and talk about these prints by Isabella Kirkland. These are very recent additions to the museum's collection. Just last year we acquired them. And these are a series called Taxa. And the artist has a strong background in terms of the relationship between art and science. So she actually trained as a taxidermist and worked as a taxidermist for a while, stuffing birds for museums. But she has a great respect for the natural world, and that's what really prompted her to do this particular series. So these are all about the human interaction with the natural world and what has resulted from it. So the first two prints are called Ascendant and Descendant. And Ascendant are all plants and animals that, I'm sorry, Descendant and Ascendant. Descendant are all plants and animals that are threatened, and Ascendant are all plants and animals that are increasing in number and are pushing out native species. Then we have Trade and Collection, and these are all about that kind of desire to acquire that we have as humans, and this interest in the exotic again. So these are all things that are collected and things that have been sold both legally and illegally. So you'll see like the ivory tusk, you'll see things that are popular for exotic pets. And then the last two are Back and Gone. And Back is a sort of hopeful image. These are all species that were thought to have been extinct and then were either refound in the wild or were propagated in gardens or otherwise brought back from the brink of extinction by human intervention. And the last one is some 60 species that have all become extinct since Europeans came to the New World. So all, you know, quite recently. And I know that Chris.
Yeah. I have all kinds of stories about these, and I don't know how long we want to go, but maybe I'll start. I'll pick out a few. You might recognize Echinacea in here and wonder why it's in the declining one. This is a rare species of Echinacea that's only found in Tennessee, and its habitat is really different from the really widespread purple coneflower that is widely grown. It is a native wildflower as well, but this one only lives in cedar glades, and this is a habitat that is really, you know, the habitat itself is being destroyed, and this plant along with it. This is sort of the marquee plant, one of the marquee plants for that habitat type. But there's been some great conservation efforts around those really cool habitats, and this plant was actually just delisted off of the federal endangered species list, which is always a cause for celebration. You know, things are either delisted because they've gone extinct or because they've been protected to the extent that we feel like they're safe. And so their habitats have been protected mostly by the Nature Conservancy in these cedar glades in Tennessee for us to say, okay, I think that's going to stick around for a while. So descendant, yes, but hopefully stable. Not the case for all of these. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say that one of the reasons why Isabella Kirkland chose this kind of format, which if you look at some of the earlier plants, like on the far wall behind you, the images rather, you can see that tradition of still life. And she was looking at 17th century Dutch still life painting when she created these compositions. And the reason why she looked to that as a source was that she saw these paintings as being a way of kind of, as having a kind of permanence. So you can look at those paintings now and still identify flora and fauna to the species. So they were very accurate and very specific, and she was very interested in having this kind of painstaking, accurate detail in these images. And she actually also on her website and in the catalog that you can see on the shelf at the end of the wall has a key where she identifies all of these species and tells many of the stories of these species, and each one, as Kristina has introduced to you, has its own story. Yes?
Date and medium?
These are actually inkjet prints that were done after oil paintings, and they were published in 2008, although each of the paintings took her a year to do, so they were done over a period of a few years, and then later, a couple of years later, published as prints. And her motivation in publishing them as prints, they're a limited edition of 50, was as a way of getting this message across. So she spent a lot of time looking at these plants and animals and sketching them from life, and then creating these compositions with all of the plants and animals at their actual life size.
Yeah, the level of detail in these is really amazing. You know, botanists can tell that that is the Tennessee coneflower and not the purpurea, the common one, which is hard to capture in something that size. So she spent a long time with each one and then fitted them together, which was really, overwhelms me. So these are the ascendant ones, right? The ones that are invasive. You can probably pick your favorite one. Here's purple loosestrife right here. Right, water hyacinth. We've got some of those in the greenhouse. You do experiments with them, and then we don't feel bad, you know. Those guys. So these are the trade. Right? This is where I've got my prop. It's one of the ones we have in the greenhouses. This is the Madagascar periwinkle. Right, so anyone know the story of this guy? So there's two chemicals derived from this plant, vinblastine and vincristine, that are used in leukemia treatments now, and they're really effective. So this plant has been collected out of the wild. It's native to Madagascar. It's very hard to find in Madagascar because it's very profitable. Fortunately, it's propagated all over the world now. So it's not a rare plant, but its distribution has been dramatically altered by collection for these purposes. So there's a lot of things here. You see a lot of carnivorous plants. There's Venus flytrap in here, some pitcher plants. This is Darwin's orchid. It had that really, really long nectar tube. And Darwin hypothesized that there must exist a moth somewhere with a tongue that long, and 50 years after he died, they found the moth. Yeah. We've got that in the greenhouses as well. It's not in bloom at the moment, though. Anyway, so these are, here's the Madagascar periwinkle, right here, this guy. The rosy periwinkle is also known as. These are the ones that were just collectibles. It's not necessarily that they were useful, but they were objects of fascination. Okay, so things like peacocks, orchids all over the place. Things that people wanted to stare at for long periods of time because they were just so mind-bogglingly beautiful. So these have mostly been collected to near extinction, or their distributions have been altered. The ones that are back, my favorite one here is this beautiful flower down here. It's the Franklinia, named after Ben Franklin. We actually just planted 3 of these behind the observatory. It is indeed back, but it is thought to be extinct in the wild. It hasn't been seen since the 1820s. It was only known from one river valley in Georgia, and fortunately, the person that found it, John Bartram, was a botanist, and he got so excited that he went back and collected seeds and grew it in his garden, and it's now offspring of those seeds that we have as the only remainders of this species. So we visit Bartram's garden in Philadelphia and see the first Franklinia tree still there. So these are things that have been rescued or otherwise, coming back from the brink of extinction. And then this one is just too depressing. She was drawing from life, and in case of most of the animals, all she had was skulls and skins and things like that.